President Maduro was suddenly extradited after Venezuela was invaded. In an unprecedented event, the United States military arrested and handcuffed him, bringing him to the United States. Let's closely examine this topic today. For nearly a year, rumors circulated about a possible invasion. On January 3rd, the United States suddenly invaded Venezuela, executing a flawless military operation. Since Venezuela is larger than Panama or Grenada, most analysts thought a United States invasion would cause major damage. However, this view was proven wrong. First, the operation began with the infiltration of special forces and airstrikes. Fierce air raids started pounding Caracas, the capital of Venezuela. At the same time, continuous cyber attacks effectively blocked the movements of the Venezuelan military, and there were even power outages. While the United States was carrying out intense airstrikes, the United States 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment infiltrated Caracas. At this time, there was almost no resistance from the Venezuelan military. With the air defense barely working, they entered easily. Delta Force then infiltrated, captured President Maduro, and brought him to the United States. But the whole process took only 3 or 4 hours, and not a single person was hurt. Just one helicopter was damaged, but it still returned safely. Venezuela's military was nearly paralyzed. The La Guaira port and several military facilities were destroyed, and the military reported 40 casualties. Leaving everything else aside, just from a military perspective, it's often evaluated as a flawless operation unprecedented in history. There were even some Americans staying in Venezuela at the time, but none of them were harmed. They fully succeeded in the decapitation. During the Panama invasion, 348 Americans died over 15 days, but in Venezuela, a much larger operation, there were no casualties. They finished the operation in just 3 or 4 hours. How perfect must it have been? More than anything, Palantir and SpaceX's partnership was crucial. Using SpaceX's satellites, they tracked President Maduro in real time, and Palantir's services helped them quickly prioritize actions. With these companies' help, they successfully captured President Maduro. Even just looking at this much, the strategic benefits the United States gained from this case are quite significant. From the American perspective, Venezuela is a country right in their backyard, and it has long been a symbolic presence that has openly opposed the United States. This country didn't just oppose the United States in words, but actively brought in China and Russia, pushing back against American influence. China and Russia used Venezuela to expand their military, intelligence, energy, and diplomatic influence in Central and South America. If the United States ignores this, its security could face a direct threat. Since the Cold War, the United States has been highly sensitive to outside powers expanding influence in Central and South America. But if a scenario unfolds where President Maduro of Venezuela is suddenly extradited, the United States would, at least in the short term, have resolved one of its biggest headaches. For the United States, it would mean no longer worrying about an openly anti-American regime in the Caribbean and Central America inviting China and Russia. Of course, in this process, there is a strong possibility that anti-American sentiment could rise throughout Latin America, but this is a long-term management issue and can be set aside in the current strategic calculations. The pressure on Cuba is also significant. Cuba has received nearly free oil from Venezuela for decades, a crucial support for the Cuban regime. Currently, the Cuban economy is on the verge of structural collapse, and with both a shortage of foreign currency and an energy crisis happening at the same time, the entire society is under extreme pressure. Nevertheless, the reason Cuba has been able to endure so far is because of Venezuela's support. If Venezuela were to shift to a pro-American government, this support could be cut off at any time. If that happens, Cuba is likely to experience a shock that would be difficult to handle in a short period of time, and this could become a factor that shakes the Cuban system itself. For the United States, this gives them another way to pressure Cuba without using military force or tougher sanctions. And we can't leave out the issue of China either. The fact that a significant portion of Venezuela's oil exports, well over 90%, are heading to China was never something the United States could take lightly. China loaned Venezuela large sums and secured short-term oil supplies, addressing its energy security concerns. If the Venezuelan regime changed and United States influence increased, this oil flow could be adjusted or cut off at any time. Even President Trump has mentioned this, almost as if he were teasing about it. President Trump stated through Truth Social that Venezuelan oil would be managed by American companies, and in the process, he said not to worry because they would also export to China. Does this mean that President Trump is aware that Venezuelan oil is heading to China? And it also means that he knows this could directly impact China's energy strategy, while at the same time allowing the United States to significantly weaken China's influence in Central and South America. The United States has built a system to remove anti-American forces nearby, pressure Cuba, and disrupt China's energy supply at the same time. Taking all these points into consideration, from the United States' perspective, this issue is highly likely to lead to favorable outcomes in terms of diplomacy, security, energy, and geopolitics. The problem is the next step. Based on President Trump's statements, this issue probably won't end quickly as a short-term military operation. On January 3rd, President Trump stated in a statement that the United States would manage Venezuela until a stable, appropriate, and wise transfer of power is achieved. This can only be interpreted as meaning that the United States will effectively oversee Venezuela's sovereignty for a certain period of time. He said he can't accept another force taking power without regard for Venezuelan stability, and stated the United States is already in Venezuela and won't leave until power is properly transferred. He made it clear. These remarks suggest plans to keep United States troops near or in Venezuela and intervene almost as trustees until a new government forms. This is when the risks begin to rise quickly. From a military perspective, this operation was almost excessively perfect, and everything from infiltration to capture and withdrawal was carried out flawlessly. However, if we look back at history and consider what happened when the United States moved from successful military operations to civil operations and subsequent phases, it's hard to be completely optimistic. In Afghanistan, initial military success was followed by failed government rebuilding, security, and political stabilization, leading the United States to withdraw after heavy costs. Venezuela faces deep political divides, a collapsing economy, and complicated ties between armed groups, criminal organizations, and factions still holding some power. Though the military is paralyzed, Venezuela's main military leadership remains intact. In this situation, it's hard to say that the process of external forces intervening to restore order and establish new power will go smoothly. In fact, there is a strong possibility that unexpected resistance and prolonged chaos could occur. On top of that, we can't ignore the possibility that anti-American sentiment could spread throughout Central and South America. The Venezuela issue is not just about a regime change in one country, it also symbolizes the United States once again directly intervening in the politics of Latin American countries. This could provide a strong justification for left-leaning governments or groups with anti-American sentiment, and if the perception spreads that the United States has returned to its old interventionist diplomacy, resentment toward the United States could grow throughout Central and South America. If this trend becomes a reality, some analysts say that the United States could achieve short-term results but end up shouldering a greater diplomatic burden in the long run. It is highly likely that political controversy within the United States will also continue for quite some time. Congress was informed of this military operation only after it concluded, not beforehand. This reignites the debate over constitutional war powers and military intervention authority. There's significant backlash in the Democratic Party since the Trump administration previously said Congress needed to approve military action against Venezuela, making this decision more controversial. There is a high possibility of ongoing legal and political disputes over whether attacking a foreign country and declaring governance without congressional consent is truly legitimate, and this could become a burden for President Trump in his future administration. In the end, regardless of the success of the military operation itself, this incident has entered a phase where its evaluation could change completely depending on how far the subsequent governance and political repercussions spread. And there's one more point to consider here: how the international community will perceive this issue. Unlike the explanation given by the United States, some countries, especially China, Russia, and France, see this incident as a clear violation of sovereignty and a dangerous precedent. If this approach is accepted, the perception will inevitably spread that powerful countries can change other nations' regimes by force whenever they wish, and this is highly likely to become a significant destabilizing factor for the entire international order. But in contrast, pro-American countries praise the actions and are continuing to do so, so this incident also showed how the international community is divided. In the end, the United States achieved tremendous results, but at the same time, it now faces a situation where it must make decisions while bearing equally heavy responsibilities and risks. What do you think about the invasion of Venezuela? Please let us know in the comments. That's it for this video. Thank you.